He thought it was only a casual meeting until she stopped him at the door and asked, "Do you even recognize my face?" It was 5:17 p.m. on a Thursday, in a small town that kept its clocks honest and its gossip quieter than the town square clock. The corner cafe smelled like brown sugar and rain on pavement, the kind of smell that presses itself into your clothes and your memory. Daniel Mercer, investor by trade and restless by habit, sat with his coat still buttoned as if he feared the world could unbutton him at any moment. He had promised himself 20 minutes, a pause between appointments that meant nothing and felt like everything in a life balanced on spreadsheets. He folded and refolded the paper napkin with a ritual calm that belonged to men who traded in numbers. When the door sighed open and she stepped in, there was a pause in the room like someone had held their breath for a secret. She was ordinary in a way that refused to be ignored. Hair tied back in an efficient knot, coat a shade too thin for the evening, hands that had learned to work without asking for thanks. She crossed to him and said the sentence that moved the floor under his feet, and for a moment the cafe was only two people and the hum of the espresso machine. The air tasted faintly of citrus from the barista squeegee, and a radio somewhere played an old song that had no business in a modern playlist. He had not expected to be recognized for anything but his name on a donor list, yet her eyes held a particular kind of insistence that memory cannot lie about. He said, "I am sorry, I think you have me confused." She let out a breath that was part laugh and part grief and replied, "Do you only pretend to be confused, Daniel, or do you really not see me?" The words fell like coins on the table, familiar and weighty. She placed a small folded piece of paper between their cups, the paper creased with a long life. When he unfolded it, the handwriting was a child's slanted insistence, and it read simply, "Found by the reader at the back of the children's shelf." He did not remember writing it, yet the paper smelled of library dust and lemon soap, scents that belonged to afternoons and small miracles. He did not know then that the single note he thought nothing of had been a bridge for years, a line through which lives had passed and something had rooted. Daniel had a history that explained why small things both mattered and did not. As a boy, he learned to count value by the weight of coins his father left on the table, and to measure safety by the quiet of locked doors. The house he grew up in had shelves for trophies he did not deserve, and chairs for conversations that never happened. He had learned to give without spectacle, because spectacle made giving a performance, and he wanted no audience for his guilt. In his 20s, a winter illness had taken his sister Maria, and he had sat on the hospital bench wearing the same coat he now clutched, promising himself that he would make things right with money and organization and the right paperwork. That promise turned into a life of foundations and spreadsheets, of anonymous checks and hands that never touched the lives they rearranged. In the present, he was a man with a name in the paper and an empty chair at dinner, a person who had learned to fix by funding and to care at a distance. The memory of the library note pushed at something he had shelved in himself. The boy who once slipped sandwiches into book covers so hungry children would not be seen. He had thought that small anonymous acts were tidy, closed loops. He did not expect those loops to fray and re-knot themselves into relationships. He was not prepared for the way guilt and possibility could sit together at a table and ask to be fed. Their conversation at the cafe expanded like a tide, taking in a shoreline of details. She introduced herself as Hannah Price. He asked questions, and she answered with short sentences that hid long histories. "You left a sandwich and a note," she said. "It was 2009. I was 12. I was hiding behind the Peter Rabbit books." He heard the name Peter Rabbit like a small bell. "I did not know it then," he said. "I did not know it mattered." She looked at him slow and honest and said, "It did." Around them, the cafe went on. Spoons and cups, the hiss of steam, a clock that insisted on time. Daniel asked, "Why now?" And she replied, "Because the past is loud when you are about to lose the thing that matters." Their voices moved between memory and present. He admitted that he had given anonymously to the library and to lunches and to causes that no one named out loud. She told him about a girl named Lily who used to sit in the library with her knees under her chin, about a small yellow envelope that kept getting moved from table to table until someone finally read it aloud. He asked about Lily, and she said, "Lily is my daughter." There was a pause. He tasted the coffee, bitter and now suddenly very sharp. He did not know whether he wanted to claim intimacy or to step away from it. She said, "I have been trying to find you for years, but I did not want charity. I wanted to tell you this story." The story was a gentle claim, a child who learned to trust because someone left an anonymous kindness at the right time. Curiosity led him to the library the next morning, the place where an act had become a lifeline. The library smelled like old glue and sunshine trapped in paper, and the tiles near the entrance still had scuffs from children running in from the rain. He met Mr. Alvarez, the librarian, who had been on duty when the note appeared. "That envelope changed that winter," Mr. Alvarez said, voice low. "There was a girl who came every day with a small appetite and a big imagination." Mr. Alvarez's face had the patient lines of someone who had read all the endings twice. Lily was there too, hands sticky from the cookies the library gave after story hour, hair in a tangle that suggested both adventure and a fatigue that belonged to parents working double shifts. She looked at Daniel with the frankness only children can afford. She said, "You left me a sandwich and a book. I kept the book." She tapped the spine of a battered picture book that had been her anchor. Daniel crouched to be on her level and asked, "Which book?" She answered, "The one about the little bear who learned to share." Her small voice held no accusation. It held only the fact of memory. He felt the fences drop in a way he had not anticipated, like a coat taken off in a warm room. The sound of pages turning was a backdrop, a patter like rain. He smelled the lemon polish of the librarian's desk and tasted something like ash, the residue of having been late to feel. He asked Lily, "Are you okay?" She shrugged with the honesty of a child and said, "We are okay." Then she added, "Sometimes Dad gets angry." The word Dad pulled the scene into a different weather. Hannah's small house, when he visited, was a study in scarcity that still preserved dignity. There were stacked bills on the kitchen table, an envelope with a red stamp that suggested a final notice, a kettle that whistled like a warning. The walls held framed drawings Lily had made at school, and a photograph of Hannah's mother smiling with a chipped mug. A yellow envelope lay on the table, the same color as the one he had once tucked into books, and his breath stumbled at the symmetry. Hannah found the envelope and turned it like an artifact. "This is from the clinic," she said. The clinic's letter explained a surgery and an estimate that made them breathe too quickly. Daniel sat across from the notice and felt a narrow place open in his chest. He offered help. She paused and then said, "I cannot take money. We cannot take money. Not from rich men who parade pity." The word pride was thick in her throat. He tried to insist gently, "This is not charity, it is help." She shook her head and said, "My dignity is not negotiable." He learned then that help can be a wound as much as a balm if it strips someone of their agency. He slid an invitation instead. "Let me help with the paperwork. Let me look at options. Let me be a resource, not a spectacle." Her eyes softened and she said, "You can do that." Around them, the sounds of the street filtered in, a dog barking like an unanswered question, tires whispering, a child's laughter that did not belong to theirs. Night brought a phone call that was small at first, and then a storm. A neighbor called to say Lily had fallen off the back steps, a trip that bled more than anyone expected. Daniel drove like a man trying to outrun regret. The rain slapped the windshield in a cadence that matched the tempo of his thoughts. At the emergency entrance, the fluorescent lights were too honest. Nurse Rosa met them with a practiced calm. "We will take her to imaging," she said, and explained in plain terms the procedure, the scans that would show if there was internal bleeding. In 2 sentences, she transformed his terror into a checklist, which made him both grateful and ashamed. In the waiting room, every minute extended like a match on a string. In the emergency smell, he noticed metal and the antiseptic scent, the tang of fear. Hannah sat with her head bowed, hands clasped like a prayer that had learned to look modest. Daniel sat beside her and read, to occupy his mouth and keep his hands from useless fidgeting. He read the picture book that had once been a bridge between them, the words soft and slightly crooked from years of page-turning. They whispered to each other in low exchanges, less than 10 words each at a time, trying to make a fortress of whispers. When the doctor returned and said the word fracture and then the word surgery, the air shifted. The list of things to do became visible: consent forms that required signatures, an estimate of costs that landed like cold coins, a phone number for a social worker who could advise on payment plans. Daniel heard terms he had only skimmed in reports before: indemnity, pre-authorization, guardianship paperwork. The hospital social worker explained that a custody claim could complicate billing and care, and that if an ex-partner emerged with legal papers, the process would slow. She explained gently what temporary custody petition meant and how the court could issue an emergency order to determine immediate guardianship. When she said the word petition, he felt the moment thin and precarious. The immediate decision was to authorize the surgery. He signed the form with a hand steady, not because he was not scared, but because he was unwilling to let paperwork be the gatekeeper of a child's care. The night in the pediatric ward became a small kingdom of small rituals that bonded them. He sat in a plastic chair that was not made for comfort and held Lily's small hand when she slept, the skin warm and smelling faintly of antiseptic and orange juice. They took turns reading the picture book aloud. "Once there was a bear who learned to share," he read, and his voice lowered into a register that felt like mending. Hannah watched him with a look that was part wonder, part apology. "You always read like you mean it," she said. He replied, "I sometimes wish I had been better at this sooner." Their sentences were short and careful, each one a small stone placed in the river that moves people from strangers to something that looks like family. He stroked Lily's hair like it was fragile porcelain and not a small child with a future. The room smelled of lemon cleaner and baby shampoo. A volunteer named Tom brought warm soup and a thermos of tea, and a pastor called Jonah sat in the corner nodding as if prayers had physical currency. Nurse Rosa checked the IV with a soft efficiency. Each person had a name and a small action. Maria, the social worker, left a pamphlet with resources. Officer Cole had been on duty when Hannah's ex had to be calmed earlier that week. Evelyn from the community center stopped by with a fleece blanket. Those names were a small map of a community that could form when one person no longer held the burden alone. Tension rose when the man from Hannah's past returned with papers. Mark Hale arrived like a weather front, abrupt, loud, claiming wrongs he had not owned. He stood in the ward doorway, his voice carrying the sharpness of someone used to taking. He told the nurse quickly that he was Lily's father and that he was filing for custody unless he was given access immediately. His claims had the smell of legal threat. Daniel stood and said, "If you are listing claims, you will need proper paperwork." Mark snapped, "We will see what the court says." The tension in that room split air into two types, the one that is about care and the one that is about claims. In private, Hannah told Daniel about Mark's debts and how he had left them once before. She said, "He does this when he needs leverage." The first half of the moment was a flood of internal fear for Hannah, thoughts tangling into blame at herself for Lily's condition and the public possibility of losing her. The second half was action. Daniel called Attorney Bennett, a local lawyer who owed him a favor, and they began to assemble documents, witness names, and a plan for a temporary guardianship petition. The court process was explained again in plain language. An emergency hearing could determine who had the authority to consent to medical treatment immediately and to protect Lily from a predatory claim while the matter was decided. This two-stage of tension, the internal collapse and the outward fight, lasted in the small hours with coffee cups piling and files collected like armor. The courtroom was a wooden room that smelled of shoe leather and old varnish. Judge Harris entered with a presence that suggested he had read too many human endings at once. The hearing was swift but not simple. Mark's attorney argued for a father's rights, citing presumed paternity and the urgency of parental connection. Hannah's counsel and attorney Bennett argued about the absence of regular contact and presented school records, the library patron records that had shown Hannah's consistent presence with Lily, and a neighbor's testimony about Mark's sporadic involvement. There were 8 exchanges of arguments and objections that felt like a chess game played in a room where the pieces were human lives. The judge asked pointed questions about the child's best interest, about who had been there during illness, and about whether temporary custody should be awarded to maintain continuity of care. The legal terms arrived steady and precise, but the room never lost the undercurrent of people with names and stories. At one point, Mark blurted something petty, and the judge admonished him with a look that could fold a paper into a plane. The judge reserved a ruling and asked the social worker to prepare a recommendation for temporary guardianship. It felt like waiting on a hinge. After the courtroom, an envelope arrived at the hospital desk, yellow and thick, anonymous in its lack of signature. The hospital administrator opened it with a nurse's curiosity and found a check with a significant sum and a note that read, simply, "For Lily's care." The way the words were written did not seek praise, it sought privacy. Speculation ran like a current through the staff. Some guessed it was from a local charity. Some thought a foundation had heard and stepped in. Hannah stood frozen, hands pressed to her mouth. Daniel felt recognition and a small tidal pull of old habits. He could have announced himself. He could have told everyone he had been the one to leave sandwiches in libraries years ago, and that the chain of small kindnesses had led back to this moment. But he remembered Hannah's insistence on dignity. He suggested instead a plan that preserved anonymity and agency. He worked with attorney Bennett and nurse Rosa to set up a trust fund that paid the bills directly to the hospital, asked the judge to seal certain records to protect Lily's privacy, and arranged for a community fund to cover future educational costs without naming a donor. When asked later, the hospital clerk said it had been an act that respected the family's wishes and the child's privacy. The judge's final order granted temporary guardianship to Hannah pending a full review, citing the continuity of care and the child's best interest. The courtroom reaction was subdued and full of relief, like a town exhaling. The aftermath unfolded in small, deliberate steps. Hannah did not sign a press release. She refused interviews. She accepted stabilization and care, the little rituals of recovery. A new backpack for Lily with her name stitched neatly on the tag. A weekly reading hour at the library with Mr. Alvarez, and a plaque that read, "For families, by families, without names." Daniel volunteered at story hour once a month, but asked that there be no announcement. He sat near the back where he could see Lily and Hannah chat. A private smile shared across a public space. He started a silent scholarship through the community center that paid for after-school programs and was administered by Evelyn and Pastor Jonah to ensure decisions were made by local hands. Officer Cole volunteered to teach a safety class at the community center, and Tom organized a small meal train for nights when Hannah had to work late. These are acts that respected pride and stitched together a safety net without spectacle. 1 month later, Lily could climb the small stairs at the library again, albeit slowly, with Hannah beside her and Daniel carrying the book bag. There was a small ceremony of sorts, a ribbon of yarn cut instead of a ribbon of silk, the children clapping and Mr. Alvarez nodding as if this was what libraries always hoped to do. 3 months on, Hannah had secured a stable job with a nonprofit, and the community center had a new reading table funded anonymously, with a small plaque that read quietly, in the words the donor preferred, to remind us what kindness does. 6 months later, Lily was reading aloud to a group of huddled preschoolers, her voice steady and bright. The legal case faded into a footnote when Mark settled on a visitation schedule that respected boundaries and was monitored until he proved consistent. Daniel's life did not change in the way tabloids might have liked. His meetings were still full and his office still had a plaque with his name.
but he started to answer his phone less, and his invitations to galas with more no's and a few yeses that meant he would be present in small ways. He had learned that presence was a kind of currency no ledger could balance. There were moments when questions returned like old friends. Did he do enough? Had anonymity been the right choice? Hannah once caught him looking at the small yellow envelope that had been kept in a drawer and asked, "Why did you hide?" He replied, "Because I was afraid of what my face would do to you." She said simply, "Your face did not matter. Your actions did." In a closing image that felt like a small truth, Lily placed the same battered picture book on the library shelf, slipping a fresh note into it that read, "Found by a reader who needed one." The note was a soft echo of the one that had started it, proof that cycles of small kindnesses can continue if respected.
Someone remembers to tuck them into books and into days. If this story touched you, think about the small thing you can do this week that costs little and keeps a person's dignity intact. Share in the comments a simple moment that changed your life, starting with, "It was when I," and if you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe to hear how quiet acts rearrange whole futures. In the end, he had meant to be a man who wrote checks. He became a man who learned to hold hands, read aloud, and be present. The last image lingers. A child reading by lamplight, a yellow envelope tucked between two pages, and the knowledge that sometimes the smallest gestures are the ones that make a town whole again.